purposes for people entering the country.
Well, let's bring in our Wednesday panel now, two of Victoria's finest, the Liberal MP Katie Allen and Labor's Peter Murphy. Welcome to both of you. Katie Allen, I want to start with you. We're now talking about booster shots, but given we have seen some complacency around the country, particularly in those states that haven't been hit by lockdown, such as Victoria, New South Wales, the ACT has, do you think there's actually going to be any difficulty in getting people to line up and get their booster shots when the time comes for them?
Well, I have to say, you know, with the changes to the possibility of opening up, which is happening now right across the country following the national plan, I think Australians are great vaccinators and they've got enthusiastically behind this vaccination program. So we know that once you've had your first shot, there's a very high uptake for the second shot, and we are looking to see across the country well above 80, 85, 90% immunisation. We look to be perhaps the most vaccinated country in the world. So, you know, of course, the third booster shot will probably be a little bit lower, but that's still incredibly high rates, which is fantastic news for Australians and fantastic news for our opportunities to ease restrictions going forward.
So you're not worried that as we get back to normal, people are going to think, OK, the worst is past us, we don't really need to go and line up and get our third shot?
Well, you always have to worry about those things, but I have to say we do know the first and second shots are really, really closely linked. People get that, and people do understand that the COVID vaccine's there to protect them, to protect their families, to protect the country, and I think it's just going to be business as usual. So yes, there will be a slight drop with the third dose, that's to be expected, but it'll be high enough to give Australia the protection it needs to get back, to be connected with the rest of the world, to get back to work, to get businesses opened up, and really to start Australia going again.
Peter Murphy, I mean, you must be pleased to see the high vaccination rates in your neck of the woods, but elsewhere around the country we're still seeing some states and territories, Queensland, WA, South Australia, lagging behind. What do you think needs to be the message now to those jurisdictions to go and get the shot?
I think the message is really clear. To get back to life that resembles life before COVID, we need to be vaccinated. You know, that's been the message from day one. If you can get vaccinated, get vaccinated. I mean, as Katie said, we are a vaccination country, and I think the success, particularly in Victoria and New South Wales, has shown that when the vaccine became available, people were ready to get vaccinated. And what's been really pleasing is younger people have just rolled up their arms as soon as, rolled up their sleeves, I don't think you roll up your arm, right? Rolled up their sleeves as soon as they can. So I think that is a really, really important message to get into the states and also some of the areas that haven't been vaccinated, because of course averages are just averages, and there are still some communities where vaccination rates are very low. Some of that's because of misinformation that's been spread, some of that's because the vaccination rollout hasn't got there early enough or well enough. So we have to continue to really push hard to make sure that everyone gets that opportunity to be vaccinated and then gets the boosters.
So what would you be looking for in the next couple of weeks and months with regards to those communities that are maybe in Victoria or in New South Wales that do have a much lower vaccination rate than others?
Well, I know the Victorian government has been putting pop-up vaccination centres in areas where some of the vaccination rates were lower. I mean, my community's done very well, but for example, Frankston North and Carrum Downs was a bit lower than the rest of my electorate, and there's pop-up vaccination site put up there. I think the vaccination mandates, while they've been difficult for people, have really shown people how important it is to get vaccinated to go to work. And I think it remains incumbent on the federal government and the state governments to get that public health message out there. You know, it's great to hit 80%, but we want to get higher. The higher we get, the more people who are protected, the less chance that people who can't get vaccinated for whatever reason will get sick and die.
It is something that Victorians are all too accustomed to, these high case numbers. You've seen it throughout the pandemic. But as we start to move towards opening up, Katie Allen, do you think it's going to be a struggle to get the broader public to adapt to accepting higher case numbers and looking at hospitalisation figures rather than those, or after months of us sort of looking at case numbers and in some cases being quite concerned about that?
Look, I have to say, you know, we had an announcement of opening up when we were actually at our peak of 2,200 cases, and I can tell you people are so desperate for those restrictions to be lifted that they just know that we've got a good vaccination rate. They've been rolling up their sleeves, as Peter has said, and they just want to get back to their normal life. They really are over lockdown, and they're really over this broad lockdown. They want to move to a new stage, and that's what the national plan is doing. It's planned that out for many months ago as we move forward, that we're going to change the way that we deal with COVID. Of course, in 2020, there were ways that we dealt with it that were completely different from now. Now that we have a high vaccination rate, people do need to adjust their thinking about what that means. And I do think, in the middle of the year, I would have liked us to see us moving to more talking about vaccination rates and looking at that sort of competitiveness across the states, because it would have helped, bring on a bit more interest, I think, in the uptake of the vaccine. We sort of really only got to that point when the lockdown issues, started to be connected very closely to this point about vaccination. So I think people have been watching the vaccination numbers very carefully. I'm pleased that the media seems to be moving towards reporting and understanding that it's hospitalisations that will be the important drivers, because remember, of the case numbers, not everybody with COVID is sick. In fact, some people are completely asymptomatic. So we're most interested in the hospitalisation numbers and, of course, ICU numbers. And unfortunately, every death is a terrible tragedy. So, of course, we want to keep that as low as possible. But that's the good news, isn't it? The vaccine rates here and around the world is showing that we're suppressing those death curves and disconnecting COVID cases from mortality. And that's the good news story here.
And, Katie, we're hearing in Victoria daily that the people in hospital, people who are really sick, something like 80 to 90% of them are unvaccinated. It is a pandemic of the unvaccinated now, which is why we have to get into those communities where people aren't vaccinated and really get that message in.
I do want to move on to the other big topic of the day, and that is, of course, the net zero announcement from the Prime Minister yesterday. Katie Allen, you were on the election campaign. It was your first election campaign back in 2019. You and I would know full well how much time and energy the Prime Minister spent criticising Labor for not having any sort of modelling or cost attached to their climate policies. Yet here we've got the modelling still under wraps and we're being assured it will be released eventually, but no actual time frame. How do you get the public to actually accept what you're saying here with any sort of veracity?
Well, when COVID happened, it was a big event, and then there was a step out of different plans and modellings and information that became available. So we're not going to, have it all at our fingertips in the public domain day one.
And COVID was an emergency. This is something that's been dragging on for years.
Well, I'd say this is a pivotal moment in our history. I mean, from day one of being elected, have always said it's not a matter of if, but how and when. Well, we've now, yesterday, moved from not a matter of if and when, but how. Now, that is an historic moment. We have now got, Australia heading in the right direction, and it hasn't just happened overnight. So when I got pre-selected February the 24th, 2019, the Prime Minister came to Macnamara with the Emissions Reduction Fund and talked about some of the nascent and early issues about what we were going to talk about with regards to addressing the issue of climate. So he talked about that right back in 2019. Now, it is true that the election in 2019 was different from what the election in 2022 is going to be about. 2022 is going to be about who do you trust to deliver a strong economy to make sure that we have the jobs, the security, the health outcomes, and of course the action on climate that we need as Australia to make sure we can grasp the opportunities that are heading at speed towards us. Now, I sat on the Trade and Investment Growth Committee here in Parliament over the last 2 years, and it has been very, very clear that the world is changing and the business around which we have based our economy on is changing, and we need to be prepared for that. And there's been a lot of work put into the roadmap, the low emissions technology strategy and the investment roadmap, looking at what I've talked about here in Parliament and in op-eds about the 5 low emissions technology stretch targets. Those are the debates that we need to be having now. How do we make this energy commercialisable and scalable? Because Australia has always depended on cheap energy. We now need to make sure that cheap green energy is at the focus and heart of our economic future.
Well, I do want to bring Peter Murphy in there. You heard that this campaign is going to be on who do you trust to be actually delivering climate policy there. When Labor sees this modelling, what do you think are the key elements that need to be addressed there?
What modelling? I mean, honestly, the big announcement was a change in words from some sort of aspiration to possibly net zero by the middle of the century to we'd like net zero by the middle of the century. No legislated target of net zero by 2050. No new policies. The government's own document said no new policies, no modelling, no costing. We've heard from the Treasury Department today that in the life of this government, it has never once costed climate change policies. You know, this is the biggest greenwash attempt that we've ever seen. So who do you trust to deliver on climate change policies? It can't be the Prime Minister in the government that said that electric vehicles would ruin the weekend. It can't be the Prime Minister in the government that took coal into the Parliament and waved it around. And what has the last 2 weeks been about? All of these negotiations with the Nationals, all these conniptions within the government, Barnaby Joyce running climate change policy, and the big announcement apparently is that Keith Pitt gets to be in Cabinet. And that's the new climate change policy for this government.
But there is modelling. You can see it if you have a look.
Where
at
is
the
it?
report.
It's
So I actually
not-
said
it's
it on a
not in
speech
there.
today. So it says that we know the investment roadmap will decrease emissions by 40%. We know that we've already got our emissions down 20%, and we also know with updated projections by 2030 that it'll be 30 to 35%. Now we know that technology is not a straight curve. We know, I'm a scientist, I know that particularly you need a diversified portfolio. So there are new technologies that are coming on board, which through investments in ARENA and the CFC, that Australia
Things
is
that your
going
government
to be,
tried to abolish.
that Australia is going to be front and centre with regards to, we're in a very good position in the Asia Pacific to supply green energy, not just to us, but to overseas. Now, I was out at a hydrogen hub this morning, and we were looking at electrolysers taking water, using clean energy from the ACT grid, and then converting it into hydrogen. It's very cold. You put it into the electric vehicle, which is hydrogen powered, and it's at the moment it's very expensive. So you can produce 1 kilo of hydrogen, 1 kilo, then can take a car 100 kilometres. Now, if it's $6 100 kilometres, that's going to be expensive. So we need to get these costs down. And that's why when you do modelling, you have to include the way that the community is going to uptake it and consumers. You've got to model all sorts of things. So we have already said things like 40% we expect will be coming from the investment in the roadmap. We've also know that there's new global technologies that are likely to come on board. We know that we've already made a significant contribution and delivering over and above our international
I
obligations.
do want to give Peter Murphy one last go.
No plans to deliver them. And when Katie says who do you trust a government which won't legislate net zero by 2050? Because as Matt Canavan says, if you don't legislate it, then you don't have to do it after the next election. That puts Keith Pitt into Cabinet, that climate change was held hostage by Barnaby Joyce, who doesn't really even still believe in net zero by 2050, and a Prime Minister who made an announcement without costings, without modelling, and said we have no new policies to go with it, apart from possibly some pork barrelling for the Nationals as we head to an election. They do not have a real commitment to what we need to do for jobs, investment and protection of the planet. They don't.
We do unfortunately have to wrap there to let you both get to question time. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Good on you.
Well, today's been the